I am delighted to introduce and to welcome Ruha Benjamin to Columbia GSAPP and to our Digital Urbanisms Symposium today. Ruha is an associate professor in Princeton's Department of African American Studies, and she's the founder of the Just Data Lab, faculty associate in the Center for Information Technology Policy, and also in the program on history of science, the Center for Health and Well-Being, the program on gender and sexuality studies, and the list goes on from there, but I'll stop there. She has not one, but two new books out this year: Captivating Technology, Race, Carceral Technoscience, and Liberatory Imagination in Everyday Life, as well as Race After Technology, mine is heavily marked, Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code. Her full bio is in the program, and I encourage all of you to read it so as to indulge me for just a moment, because I think Ruha's incredible and frankly flexible scholarship, and what I'm certain will be an important voice in our discussion today are better served if I swerve this introduction just a little bit through her words rather than mine. In the introduction of this one, Race After Technology, she offers her personal experience as somehow gymnastics, I tell you, somehow both case in point and counterexample to the practices of algorithmic profiling to tailor online ads, explaining, quote, as a Black woman whose sister-in-law was killed in a mass shooting, who has had to shelter in place after a gunman opened fire in a neighboring building minutes after I delivered a talk, and who worries that my teenage sons may be assaulted by police vigilantes. Fair enough, she says. Maybe a gun-toting white man wouldn't be the best advertising image for selling to her. This is one of just many examples of generosity to her reader, of accessible acts of familiarity, of personhood in her work, that belie a project much broader than the academic. It is clear to me that Professor Benjamin is a talented and committed pedagogue, and that hers is also a large project of public pedagogy. Indeed, she says, quote, I teach like my life depends on it, end quote. For myself and my colleagues, and for all of us here who teach, we know that such a claim is really made because it does depend on it. In more ways than one, the topics we're talking through today and those that we teach, these are matters of urban and social life as we know it, matters of living free and self-determined lives, and sometimes, in cases of post-truths and their aftermaths, like we saw this morning, they can be matters of life and death. With that, please join me in welcoming Professor Ruha Benjamin. I, for one, am hoping to get schooled.
Good afternoon. That was a really thoughtful and generous introduction. I really appreciate that. My wonderful colleague, Professor Meisterlin, and all the conference organizers, thank you for inviting me into the conversation. I'm thrilled to be here, and let's get started. Please join me in acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Lenape. Let us also acknowledge the intertwined legacies, the devastation of transatlantic slavery and settler colonialism, which contribute to the creation and continued wealth of this university and the nation-state itself. We acknowledge the reparations owed to Black and Indigenous communities and nations and the impossibilities of return of generations past. Let's also acknowledge the ancestors in the room today as we fight together for better futures. We are alive at a time of greater mobilization to preserve this planet and all the beautiful creation that are no doubt worthy of the struggle. Ashe. So let me begin with 3 provocations, a kind of trailer for the talk, if you will. That way, if you get distracted or you start getting notifications on your phone or what have you, you'll at least know the 3 takeaways as I hope for them. First, racism is productive, not in the sense of being good, but in the literal capacity of racism to produce things, of value to some, even as it wreaks havoc on others. We're taught to think of racism as an aberration, a glitch, an accident, an isolated incident, a bad apple, in the backwoods, and outdated, rather than innovative, systemic, diffuse, an attached incident, the entire orchard, in the ivory tower, forward-looking, productive. In sociology, we like to say race is socially constructed, but we often fail to state the corollary that racism constructs. Secondly, I'd like us to remember or think about the way that race and technology shape one another. More and more people are accustomed to thinking about the ethical and social impact of technology, but as we know, this is only half of the story. Social values, norms, structures, all exist prior to any tech development. So it's not simply the impact of technology, but the social inputs that make some inventions appear inevitable and desirable. Which leads to a third provocation, that imagination is a contested field of action, not an ephemeral afterthought that we have the luxury to dismiss or romanticize, but a resource, a battleground, an input and output of technology and social order. In fact, we should acknowledge that most people are forced to live inside someone else's imagination. And one of the things we have to come to grips with is how the nightmares that many people are forced to endure are the underside of elite fantasies about efficiency, profit, social control, and even beautiful design. Racism, among other axes of domination, helps to produce this fragmented imagination, monopoly for some, misery for others. This means that for those of us who want to construct a different social reality, one grounded in justice and joy, we can't only critique the underside, but we also have to wrestle with the deep investments, the desire even, for social domination. So that's the trailer. Now let's turn to some specifics, beginning with a relatively new app called Citizen, which will send you real-time crime alerts based on a curated selection of 911 calls. It also offers a way for users to report, live stream, and comment on purported crimes via the app. And it also shows you incidents as red dots on a map so you can avoid particular areas, which is a slightly less racialized version of apps called Ghetto Tracker and Sketch Factor, which use public data to help people avoid supposedly dangerous neighborhoods. Now you're probably thinking, what could possibly go wrong? In the age of barbecue Beckys calling the police on Black people cooking, walking, breathing out of place. It turns out that even a Stanford-educated environmental scientist living in the Bay Area is an ambassador of the carceral state, calling the police on a cookout at Lake Merritt. It's worth noting, too, that the app, Citizen, was originally called the less chill name Vigilante. And in its rebranding, it also moved away from encouraging people to stop crime, but rather now to avoid it. As one member of the New York City Council put it, crime is now at historic lows in the city, but because residents are constantly being bombarded with push notifications of crime, they believe the city is going to hell in a handbasket. Not only is this categorically false, it's distracting people from real public safety issues like reckless driving or the rising opioid use that don't show up on the app. What's most important to our discussion, I think, is that Citizen and other tech fixes for social problems aren't simply about technology's impact on society, but also about how racial norms and values shape what tools are imagined necessary in the first place. This dynamic is what I take up in two new books. The first examines the interplay between race automation and machine bias more broadly as an extension of older forms of racial domination. The second is an edited volume on the carceral dimensions of technology across a wide range of social arenas, from more traditional sites like policing and prisons to less obvious contexts like the retail industry and digital service economy. As just one example from this volume, a chapter by Madison Van Oort draws on her ethnography of worker surveillance in the retail industry, where the same companies pitching products to the Department of Corrections are also pitching them to H&M and Forever 21. And even as she shows how workers are tracked well beyond the confines of their workplaces to include even their online activity, let's pause for a minute on the way that technology enables domination in the context of work more broadly and turn to speculative fiction as part of our expanding our imagination. So a brief interlude.
Character as he crosses the border for the first time. So you see, he's in Mexico, but he comes to America in a new way.
Cerca de la colonia donde vivía, en las afueras de la ciudad, estaban las infomaquilas, los sleep dealers.
Este es el sueño americano. Le damos a los Estados Unidos lo que siempre han querido. Todo el trabajo, sin los trabajadores. José está en un matadero en Iowa y María es niñera de una niñita en Washington. Ustedes tres van a estar en una chambota en San Diego. Muchacho, enchúfate. Tu futuro empieza hoy.
So this film, Sleep Dealers by Alex Rivera, illustrates how the fantasy of some is connected to the nightmare of others, and that embodiment does not magically cease to matter, but can actually become intensified and more intrusive through automated systems. Two recent works I recommend that expose the labor involved in maintaining the mirage of disembodiment are Behind the Screen by Sarah Roberts and The Cleaners, a documentary on Netflix, both of which are concerned with content moderators. So how should we understand the duplicity of technological fixes, purported solutions that nevertheless reinforce and even deepen existing hierarchies? In terms of popular discourse, what got me interested in this question was the proliferation of headlines and hot takes about so-called racist robots, A first wave of stories seemed to be shocked at the prospect that, in Langdon Winner's terms, artifacts have politics. A second wave seemed less surprised. Well, of course, technology inherits its creators' biases. And now I think we've entered a phase of attempts to override or address the default settings of racist robots, for better or worse. And one of the challenges we face is how to meaningfully differentiate technologies that are used to differentiate us. Take, for example, what we might call an old school targeted ad. And I saw that there was one of the talks earlier had to do with redlining. So I hope that this connects up with the conversation this morning. So in this case, a housing developer used this flyer to entice white families to purchase a home in the Leimert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, which is where my own grandparents eventually infiltrated, which was the language used at the time. But at this point in the story, the developers were trying to entice white buyers only by promising them, quote, beneficial restrictions. These were racial covenants that restricted someone from selling their property to black people and other unwanted groups. But then comes the Civil Rights Movement, Black Power Movement, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which sought to protect people from discrimination of this sort when renting or buying a home. But did it? Today, companies that lease or sell housing can target their ads to particular groups without people even knowing that they're being excluded or preyed upon. And as ProPublica investigators have shown, these ads are often approved within minutes, though my understanding is that because of the lawsuit brought against Facebook, they've changed these options. So I don't think you can target vulnerable groups or these protected classes, rather. Though it's worth noting that in just the last few weeks, advocacy groups have brought the first civil rights lawsuit against housing companies for discriminating against older people using Facebook's ad system. So in an effort to connect old and new, the combination of coded bias and imagined objectivity is what I term the new Jim Code. Innovation that enables social containment while appearing fairer than discriminatory practices of a previous era. This riff off of Michelle Alexander's analysis in The New Jim Crow considers how the reproduction of racist forms of social control in successive institutional forms entails a crucial socio-technical component that not only hides the nature of domination, but allows it to penetrate every facet of social life under the guise of progress. This formulation, as I highlight here, is directly related to a number of other cousin concepts by Brown, Broussard, Daniels, Eubanks, Noble, and others, and situated in a hybrid literature that I think of as race-critical code studies. This approach is not only concerned with the impacts of tech, but its production, and particularly how race and racism enter the process. Two works that illustrate this approach are Sophia Noble's Algorithms of Oppression, in which she argues that racist and sexist Google search results, like pornographic images returned when you type in the phrase black girls, grows out of a, quote, corporate logic of either willful neglect or a profit imperative that makes money from racism and sexism. In a different vein, Simone Brown examines how the history of surveillance technologies reflect and reproduce distorted notions of blackness, explaining that, quote, surveillance is nothing new to black folks. From slave ships to slave patrols to airport security checkpoints and stop and frisk policing, she points to the facticity of surveillance in black life. Both challenging a techno-deterministic approach, Brown argues that instead of seeing surveillance as something inaugurated by new technologies, to see it as ongoing is to insist that we factor in how racism and anti-blackness undergird and sustain the intersecting surveillances of our present order. And so in examining how anti-blackness gets encoded in and exercised through automated systems, I consider four conceptual offspring to the new Jim Code that follow along a kind of spectrum. Engineered inequity names those technologies that explicitly seek to amplify social cleavages. They're what we might think of as the most obvious, less hidden dimension of the new Jim Code. Default discrimination are those inventions that tend to ignore social cleavages and as such tend to reproduce the default settings of race, class, gender, among other axes of difference. Coded exposure examines the way that some technologies fail to see racial difference while others render racialized people hypervisible and exposed to systems of surveillance. And finally, techno benevolence names those developments that claim to address bias of various sorts, but may still manage to reproduce or deepen discrimination in part because of the narrow way in which fairness is defined and operationalized. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to sketch the last three to give us some sense of the structure of the book itself matches these sort of concepts. So, default discrimination includes those technologies that reinforce inequities precisely because tech designers fail to seriously attend to the social context of their work, which includes racial domination. Carceral tools that underpin the US penal system are a key feature of the new Jim Code. At every stage of the process, from policing, sentencing, imprisonment to parole, automated programs are supplanting the traditional role of humans. There was a study by ProPublica, many of you are probably familiar with, examining the recidivism risk scores assigned to thousands of people arrested in Broward County, Florida, in which they reported that the score was remarkably unreliable in forecasting violent crime, and they uncovered significant racial disparities and inaccuracies, the outputs, shall we say. But what's most concerning, I think, is how it reinforces and hides racial domination by ignoring all the ways that racism shapes the inputs. For example, the surveys given to prospective parolees to determine how likely they are to recidivate includes questions about their criminal history, education and employment history, financial history, neighborhood characteristics, among many other factors. All of these variables have been structured in one way or another by racial domination, from job market discrimination to ghettoization. The survey measures the extent to which an individual's life has been impacted by structural racism without ever asking an individual's race. Colorblind codes that on the surface appear better than a biased judge or prosecutor. Coded exposure names the tension between ongoing surveillance of racialized populations and calls for digital recognition and inclusion, the desire to literally be seen by technology. Linking historical precedents with contemporary techniques, different forms of exposure serve as a touchstone for considering how the act of viewing something or someone may put the object of vision at risk, a form of scopic vulnerability central to the experience of being racialized. What I'd like to underscore is that it's not only in the process of being out of sight, but also in the danger of being too centered that racialized groups are made vulnerable. So that being included is not simply positive recognition, but can be a form of unwanted exposure, but not without creative resistance, as I'll come back to in just a minute. But first, a brief interlude.
Hello? Motion sensors. Motioning. Motioning. Please sense me.
One other thing. Lem mentioned that there's something weird going on with the motion sensors in the lab.
Oh, yeah. We replaced all the sensors in the building with a new state-of-the-art system that's going to save money. It works by detecting light reflected off the skin.
Well, Lem says it doesn't work at all.
Lem's wrong. It does work. Although there is a problem. It doesn't seem to see black people.
The system doesn't see black people?
I know. Weird, huh?
That's more than weird, Veronica. That's basically, well, racist.
The company's position is that it's actually the opposite of racist because it's not targeting black people, it's just ignoring them. They insist the worst people can call it is indifferent.
Nothing. We never should have let that white guy off.
We're 8 black men in an elevator. Of course the white guy's gonna get off.
Veronica?
Oh, God, this looks way too aggressive.
No, it's okay. I think I know why you're all here. Well, most of you.
I have something prepared. Veronica, you are a terrific boss.
Thank you, Lem. I'll take it from here. Let me start by apologizing on behalf of Viridian for this inexcusable situation.
I laid into Veronica pretty good. I figured it was my only shot, so I took the gloves off.
Wow, that sounds great, Lem. Sounds like you gave the company a really strong message.
Oh, yeah. She said they're working 24/7 to make things right. Can you believe this?
I know, isn't it great? We all get our own free white guys.
You like it?
Yeah. Hey, Ty's the best. He anticipates everything I need. Plus, he picked up my dry cleaning. Oh, and he got this kink out of my neck.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
My white guy sucks.
Well, maybe you're just not using yours right.
Yeah, maybe it's on you, dude.
Shut up, Stu.
I got the worst black guy.
It turned out Lem had also been thinking about the money issue, and he put together some interesting numbers to show us. And then, we all went to speak to management in a language they could understand, within a margin of error of plus or minus 1%. And so, if the company keeps hiring white people to follow black people, to follow white people, to follow black people, by
Thursday, June 27th, 2013.
every person on Earth will be working for us. And we don't have the parking for that.
No way.
All right, so again, you gotta laugh to keep from crying. The show brilliantly depicts how a superficial corporate diversity ethos, prioritization of efficiency over equity, and the default whiteness of tech development work together to ensure that innovation literally produces containment. The fact that black employees are unable to use the elevators, doors, water fountains, or turn the lights on is treated as a minor inconvenience in service to a greater good. This is the invisibilizing side of the process that Alondra Nelson describes as a dialectic of surveillance and neglect that characterizes black life vis-a-vis science and technology. Finally, some of the most interesting developments, I think, are those we can think of as techno-benevolent, that aim to address bias in various ways. Take, for example, new AI techniques for vetting job applicants. A company called HireVue aims to, quote, reduce unconscious bias and promote diversity in the workplace by using an AI-powered program that analyzes recorded interviews of prospective employees. It uses thousands of data points, including verbal and nonverbal cues like facial expression, posture, and vocal tone, and compares job seekers' scores to those of existing top-performing employees to decide who to flag as a desirable hire and who to reject. The sheer size of many applicant pools and the amount of time and money that companies pour into recruitment is astronomical. Companies like HireVue can narrow the eligible pool at a fraction of the time and cost, and hundreds of companies, including Goldman Sachs, Hilton, Unilever, Red Sox, Atlanta Public School System, and many more have signed on. Another value added, according to HireVue, is that there's a lot that a human interviewer misses that AI can keep track of to make, quote, data-driven talent decisions. After all, the problem of employment discrimination is widespread and well-documented. So the logic goes, wouldn't this be more reason to outsource decisions to AI? Well, a study by a Princeton team of computer scientists examined whether a popular algorithm trained on human writing online exhibited the same racially biased tendencies that psychologists have documented among humans. In particular, they found that the algorithm associated white-sounding names with pleasant words and black-sounding names with unpleasant ones, which builds on a classic audit study that many of us teach in intro to sociology classes based on old-school resumes and the changing of names on those resumes, which I can talk more about when we open things up. So too with gender-coded words and names, as Amazon learned when its own hiring algorithm was found discriminating against women. Nevertheless, it should be clear why technical fixes that claim to bypass human biases are so desirable. If only there was a way to slay centuries of racist and sexist demons with a social justice bot. Beyond desirable, more like magical. Magical for employers, perhaps, looking to streamline the grueling work of a recruitment, but a curse for many job seekers. Whereas proponents describe a very human-like interaction, those who are on the hunt for jobs recount a very different experience. Applicants are frustrated not only by the lack of human contact, but also because they have no idea how they're being evaluated and why they're repeatedly rejected. One job seeker described questioning every small movement and micro-expression and feeling a heightened sense of worthlessness because the company couldn't even assign a person for a few minutes. As this headline puts it, your next interview could be with a racist robot, bringing us back to that problem space we started with. Though it's worth noting, some job seekers are already developing ways to subvert the system by trading answers to employers' tests and creating fake applications as informal audits of their own. In fact, one HR employee for a major company recommends slipping the words Oxford or Cambridge into your CV with invisible white ink to pass the automated screening. In terms of a more collective response, a federation of European trade unions called UNI Global Union has developed a charter of digital rights for workers touching on automated and AI-based decisions to be included in bargaining agreements. One of the most heartening developments to me is that tech industry employees themselves have been speaking out increasingly against the most egregious forms of corporate collusion with state-sanctioned racism in the form of ICE contracts, an important but limited development. And as this article published by Science for the People reminds us, contrary to popular narratives, organizing among technical workers has a vibrant history, including engineers and technicians in the 60s and 70s who fought professionalism, individualism, and reformism to contribute to radical labor organizing. The current tech workers movement, which includes students across our many institutions, can draw from past organizers' strategies and challenges in learning to navigate the contradictions and complexities of organizing in tech today. Toward that end, initiatives like Data for Black Lives and the Detroit Community Tech Project offer an even more expansive approach. The former brings together people working across a number of agencies and organizations in a proactive approach to tech justice, especially at the policy level. And the latter develops and uses technology rooted in community needs, offering support to grassroots networks doing data justice research, including Discotex, which stands for Discovering Technology, which are multimedia mobile neighborhood workshop fairs that can be adapted in other locales. And I'll just mention one of the concrete collaborations that's grown out of Data for Black Lives. A few years ago, several government agencies in St. Paul, Minnesota, including the police department and the public school system, formed a controversial joint powers agreement called the, quote, Innovation Project, giving these agencies broad discretion to collect and share data on young people with the goal of developing predictive tools to identify at-risk youth in the city. There was immediate and broad-based backlash from the community, and in 2017, a group of over 20 local organizations formed what they called the Stop the Cradle to Prison Algorithm Coalition. Data for Black Lives has been providing various forms of support to this coalition, and eventually the city of St. Paul dissolved the agreement in favor of what they call a more community-based approach, which was a huge victory for the activists and community members who'd been fighting these policies for over a year. Another abolitionist approach to the new Jim Code is the Our Data Body's Digital Defense Playbook, which introduces a set of tools for diagnosing, dealing with, and healing the injustices of pervasive and punitive data collection and data-driven systems. The playbook contains in-depth guidelines for facilitating workshops and group activities, plus tools, tip sheets, reflection pieces, and rich stories crafted from in-depth interviews with communities in Charlotte, Detroit, and LA, with the aim of engendering power, not paranoia, when it comes to technology. The fact is, data disenfranchisement and domination has always been met with resistance and appropriation, in which activists, scholars, and artists have sharpened abolitionist tools that employ data for liberation. This is a tradition in which, as Du Bois exclaimed, one could not be a calm, cool, detached scientist while Negroes were lynched, murdered, and starved. From his modernist data visualizations on your left to Ida B. Wells Barnett's expert deployment of statistics in the Red Record, there's a long tradition of employing and challenging data for Black lives. Towards that end, the late legal and critical race scholar, Derek A. Bell, encouraged a radical assessment of reality through creative methods and racial reversals, insisting that to see things as they really are, you must imagine them for what they might be, which is why I think that the arts and humanities are so vital to this discussion and movement. One of my favorite examples of a racial reversal in the Bellian tradition is this parody project that begins by subverting the anti-Black logics embedded in new high-tech approaches to crime prevention. Instead of using predictive policing techniques to forecast street crime, the white-collar early warning system flips the script by creating a heat map that flags city blocks where financial crimes are likely to occur. The system not only brings the hidden but no less deadly crimes of capitalism into view, but includes an app that alerts users when they enter high-risk areas to encourage citizen policing and awareness. Taking it one step further, the development team is working on a facial recognition program to flag individuals who are likely perpetrators. And the training set used to design the algorithm includes the profile photos of 7,000 corporate executives downloaded from LinkedIn. Not surprisingly, the average face of a criminal is white and male. To be sure, creative exercises like this are only comical when we ignore that all of its features are drawn directly from actually existing proposals and practices in the real world, including the use of facial images to predict criminality. By deliberately and inventively upsetting the status quo in this manner, analysts can better understand and expose the many forms of discrimination embedded in and enabled by technology. And so if, as I've suggested at the start, the carceral imagination captures and contains, then a liberatory imagination opens up possibilities and pathways, creates new templates, and builds on critical intellectual traditions that have continually developed insights and strategies grounded in justice. May we all find ways to build on this tradition. Thank you for your attention.
First of all, thank you. It's my distinct pleasure to get to sit at this table because I'm sure the room is filled with dozens of questions and comments, and I get to go first. Thinking through, I think, both the context of today, that fantastic talk, and really nice summary of the high points as well of the book, and also thinking about our place right now at this school with this audience, and many of whom are students. I'm going to ask maybe two broad-ish questions. The first, I think, thinking about architecture, the role of architecture, urban planning, urban design, the practices here and the professions represented here. Earlier today and later today as well, we've been having conversations on representation, on the circulation of images, of their power, of their participation in either reinforcing socio-spatial structural patterns, or calling those into question, or reframing perhaps the terms of the discussion. I'm struck in your book by the tracing of a kind of technological history, not only to talk about the co-production of race and technology, or race as a social technology, right? But that they are much longer histories of image production are still present and colluding in our understanding of what tomorrow may be based on the images we produce of it today, right? Speaking again to this notion of the imaginary. Can you comment on that?
Absolutely. So it's a question around sort of the desire for representation and the pitfalls around especially visual representation and technologies. And so, I'm of two minds. One, I think visual representation and the calls for digital recognition, like the idea that you want to be seen by technology is vital, and I appreciate that. And just my own sort of politics around aesthetics, you can tell both from my slides that I'm just weary of whiteness and trying to infuse, a wider array of humanity, even in our academic sort of aesthetics. So I care about that, and at the same time, it's calls for representation. There's a dark underside that can be exploited and enable forms of domination. And what's coming to mind, I don't know if many of you saw the headlines around Google contract workers targeting homeless people in Atlanta to get their facial images to diversify Google's training set for its new phone. Did you guys see that? And so the contract workers were directed to look for Black homeless individuals and coerce, trick them into giving up their image by giving them $5 gift cards and just telling them to play with the phone. And so this is an example where for the last, let's say, 2 years, with the fantastic work of Joy Bulamwini and others, in terms of calling out the whiteness of facial recognition and how it's very poor in identifying dark skin and black women in particular. And so this attempt to diversify and to make it better and more precise at creating an inclusive product, in Google's case, rests on a coercive process. Mm-hmm. And so to me, this is illustrative of what my colleague Kienga Yamada-Taylor describes in a completely different context, in the context of housing policy, but applies here in what she dubs predatory inclusion, right? Where the way in which calls for diversity and inclusion, we can think about this even in our own institutions, often serves the institution, or in that case, the company, whereas it's really capitalizing on the vulnerability of this population, mm-hmm. and the fact that a $5 gift card is valuable, you know? So it's capitalizing on that precarity in order to create a better product for Google. Never mind the long history of scientists who, have experimented upon, like we have so many examples of, populations whose bodies have been the substrate of honing various scientific and technological techniques, from Marion Sims to prisoners to the list goes on. And so I think about that call for visual representation and the honing of facial recognition and making it better at detecting a wider array of phenotypes in relation to this process that you have to extract this value out of vulnerable people, and how, for me, it's not a fair trade-off. And frankly, I am sympathetic to those who say we don't want to be seen by facial recognition systems. I would rather be blurry. And so this is one of those sites in which better technology can actually be harmful socially.
Modes of research, modes of analysis, and what is done with the information that is extracted, how it's understood, layered, interpolated, and made sense of. It's not only a part of the academic work that happens here, but it's also part of training our students. It's part of the purpose and the drive of the school. And within not only urban planning, but within the design disciplines as well, there is a push toward, or a sort of a constant or consistency in the there's a want to collect as many different methods as possible, without necessarily a framework that guides us toward integrating them in one way or another, right? There's an honestly joyful set of methodological experiments that are always alive in a design school, and I'm struck by the hybridity of your research approach, of your analytical approach and hybrid. And you describe and discuss a thin description as a method. You're almost always hitting at multiple registers, at multiple cultural points, and approaches to legibility, seeking out those patterns. But again, like in this facile, sort of broad-reaching kind of way. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit again on those methodological questions, because there's so much creativity that it seems to allow in your work.
Sure, yeah. And so, what you're referring to is, this idea of thin description that I draw from anthropologist John Jackson's work. So if you want the fuller version of what that's about, you could pick up his book, Thin Description. But I draw on that to sort of help me justify what I'm doing. In some ways, I'm really running against the grain of my sociological training, which is about creating order out of disorder, right? A bunch of boxes and categories and putting everything in its place and neatly having my 2x2 table, et cetera. And so for that, you go to my first book, which is a deep dive into the social dimensions of stem cell research. And for this one, I felt a little more liberated as a tenured faculty to be like, okay, I just want to study what I want to study. And here, the thin description helped me sort of frame what I was doing, which was trying to connect a bunch of dots, trying to, if you think about the thinness of screens, the thinness of skin, and trying to read the relationship between race and technology against this thinness, it runs counter also to the desire of data-driven systems to get more and more and more. Right. That is to be all-encompassing. And in this way, the book is very partial and doesn't mind being partial, and is partial in the sense that I want other people to pick it up and to do the deeper dives and to pick it up as a provocation to do more research in this area. It does not purport to be a generalized theory or conclusion of the issues that it raises. And so it's a kind of owning of the partiality of knowledge. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, that's what thinness also evokes, is that, you know, I'm touching on something and I'm thinking with other people to flesh this out in that way. And so, you know, what brought me joy in doing that is also the ability to weave in areas in popular culture that I saw the themes be taken up as well. So we're talking about Black Mirror, we're talking about, you know, hashtag conversations, and threading this together with academic debates and literature, rather than, again, creating these arbitrary boundaries between forms of knowledge, rather staging a conversation across these different domains. And so some people read it, and for example, I was at a book club conversation last night at the Princeton Public Library, and one of the women was like, I just couldn't keep track of what you were trying to tell me, and, you know, it was too unwieldy. And for some people, they enjoy that. And so, you know, it's not going to be for everyone, but hopefully it will also spur, especially students in the room, to do some of the more rigorous and perhaps disciplinary kind of treatments of some of these themes.
I think it also means there's a sort of consistency. There's an internal coherence, though, right, between the methodology that you deploy and that liberatory imaginary, right, or imagining, right? It's that technique that gives you the freedom to find those conclusions and make those connections, and that, I think, is super lovely.
Thank you. I love when people make more sense of my work than I do. Can I put that on the back cover?
It's really marked up. With that, we have about 10 minutes, 2 minutes, two questions. Never mind minutes. We have room for questions. 2 questions.
I'm a science fiction fan, first of all, and so much of what we do is just purely reactive, and I would suggest anyone who wants to think about the future, look at Afrofuturism, because it's absolutely fantastic in terms of expanding our imagination about what is possible, good and bad. I am curious when we talk about this technology, we talk about it in terms of disruption, a break from the past. And you highlight how much it is not. It's wedded in the past. Is there anything new here?
Yeah, and so part of what in that one example, I was hoping to highlight was both the continuity and the discontinuity, say, between the targeted ads of old and now. And you can take this to any of the technologies to try to trace both. So the continuity is a way that enables forms of exclusion or predatory behavior, but in the new version, when you're preyed upon or excluded, you're not necessarily aware of it. The racist boogeyman you can't point to, right? And so whether it's the judge or the police officer or the doctor or the realtor, now the part of the penetration into everyday life involves the lack of agent to point to, and thereby the greater difficulty in holding people and things accountable for harm. And it doesn't mean that it's impossible, but it means that it's taking more work. And I'll give you an example from, you know, my colleagues working to litigate algorithms and hold systems that have harmed people accountable. An example out of Michigan, where then Governor Snyder, who was also behind the Flint poisoning, became governor and decided he wanted to run the state like a company, and adopted an automated system that would be used by the unemployment agency to flag people who were committing unemployment fraud. And so this system called Midas operated for about, during a 2-year period, ended up flagging over 40,000 residents of Michigan as committing unemployment fraud. And what happened there was that 93% of those flagged were falsely flagged. And in the meantime, they had their homes foreclosed upon. They had a criminal record. Some people committed suicide. Some people got divorced. Like, it just wreaked havoc on people's lives. And now there's a class action lawsuit that's trying to find some form of redress for these people, but it involves litigating the algorithm that was introduced with very little human oversight in this case. And there are others that will also set various kinds of precedents. But this part of the challenge is this process of governing and accountability with respect to the automated system, where, you know, who you hold responsible for the harm is more of a challenge to redress. So that's one of the things that it's not a complete break, but it's just a bit more difficult to do that. And so hopefully that starts to answer. But in that choice between how much is old, how much is new, on that spectrum, I lean towards looking more at the continuities, precisely because, as you framed it, so much of the hype and the discourse is that it's some great break from the past. And so in my own analysis, I'm interested in connecting the dots more. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much
My
for
pleasure.
coming.
Yeah.
It was great. In terms of data collection, one question: what are your thoughts about the ability to collect census data online, like the new sort of policy regarding that?
You know, that's not something that I know a whole lot about, but I know that there's a group. I would encourage you to look up my colleague Mutale Nkonde, who right now is at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard. She's holding a symposium on November 2nd that's on this topic, a very topic. And unfortunately, I can't make it, but I'm sure if you reached out to her, she would have some greater insight and perspective to offer you. But she would be my go-to person to sort of break down the ins and outs of that. Yeah, unfortunately, I can't offer a very thoughtful response. Maybe we have then time for one more right here in the middle.
Speaking for the minority, my question really has to do with, to what extent can we, particularly yourself, divorce ourselves from our culture in order to come up with solutions that would benefit us? In other words,
say that divorce ourselves from I missed that word.
Well, our culture.
What is it? Culture.
Meaning that we look at the Chinese, we seem to have the answers for them. When we look at ourselves, there's much more.
Yeah.
And I am concerned that we'd always be haunted by what we don't necessarily accept as being biases in ourselves.
Yeah, I see. So kind of things that are closer to home. And so I think that that's an important insight. And then specifically in relation to the Chinese, there's a very small section of the book that's talking about the social credit system and the surveillance of Uyghurs in China. In part because that's often held up as like the most dystopian version of this. Like that's where we're headed, even though the companies, the social media we use every day have patents to do exactly those very things. And so partly my work here is to, one, make things visible and to have us question our assumptions and our sense of our own goodness and that we are the ones, who will get it right somehow. So that's part of the work, is trying to do that. But also, I think even in a given society, there are multiple worlds existing. And so another sort of practice of mine is to look at processes from its underside. So even though we share the space or we share the city, or we share this nation. There are always layers. And for me, it's important to look at what's happening from those who are potentially harmed or excluded, et cetera, because then you get a different view. And I think that's part of our role in the academy also, is to make those things visible that, maybe we would take for granted if we didn't have the time and the luxury to analyze and to think about it. So that's hopefully what I and many others I think here are trying to contribute, is to have us question our assumptions around these things. All right. I look forward to talking to everyone later.